Welcome to the next section of the Cloud Exchange. My guest today is Tony D'Angelo, the Vice President of U.S. Public Sector at Lookout. Tony, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Jason. Good to be with you today.
Now, for this session, we're focusing on how agencies can best secure their endpoints in the cloud. The recent cyber attacks have proved, once again, that agencies are in a perimeter-less environment. In fact, Gartner, the research company, estimates that about 70% of all endpoint intrusions are done through the browser. So how can agencies improve their security at their endpoints? Well, that's where Tony comes in. So Tony, let's just start right at the beginning. There are several risk factors that agencies should be concerned about. What are they, especially as they migrate more and more to the cloud?
So what we're seeing is the threat actors will tend to exploit any shift and disruption in the industry. There's been this shift to the cloud. And Jason, as you mentioned a few moments ago, there really is no perimeter, no network perimeter anymore. It creates significant opportunity for the threat actors. We've seen this slow and gradual shift to remote office and telework. One of the things we've seen recently is COVID absolutely accelerated that. And the IT organizations were not ready for that shift. So what we saw, workers wanted full access with their mobile devices to all assets inside the network. And all of the traditional endpoints that they work from, and they wanted to do that from a remote perspective. The threat actors took full advantage of that. We see most attacks starting with credential harvesting, and a lot of that is coming from SMS text, social media, etc. So that's been what we're seeing a tremendous problem, and again, all back to ransomware, which has been one of the primary attack services of late.
We've heard a lot about ransomware over the last couple of months. Obviously, the big one that we know about is the meat packing place, right? And what's interesting about that, and the fuel one as well, I almost forgot about them. That was the biggest one. Was that didn't really attack the systems that was delivering the fuel or doing the meat packing or processing, but really they attacked the back office systems, and that's really what you're getting at. Employees wanted access to those kind of mission critical back office systems, and they ended up being most vulnerable in many ways. Are agencies facing that similar challenge of how to make security and accessibility, how to balance those things?
Yeah, it's you're going to continue, I think, to see that, right? I mean, you mentioned the fuel. The fuel pipeline, as well as the meat distribution, those were largely inconvenient disruptions. I'm sure there was some economic impact there as well. But next time, what if it's a power grid, right? You look at some of the regulated industries that the federal government is very much involved in, the financial sector. We begin to have life-threatening consequences. So I think you're going to begin to see more of a public-private partnership where the government, particularly with regulated industries, is going to have more involvement, and you might even see some fines and some penalties for not reporting some of these attacks. Government workers themselves are really just as vulnerable. Again, I'll go back to where a lot of these attacks start, particularly on the mobile endpoint, as we have so much telework occurring now, and it's that initial credential harvesting effort, which again comes through a text or oftentimes some other elements of social media. Try to get you to put your username, your login password. They might load some spyware on the device, and once they have those credentials, then they're free to move inside the network. Oftentimes, it's difficult to identify exactly where that attack came from, but when they're in, and can create a whole host of problems, as we know.
All of this reminds me of the OPM hack from 2015. Very similar. Credential harvesting. They got the credentials, they got in, they island hopped, they stole data. It seems to be very similar approaches, and that agencies and other private sector organizations, they know what's happening, but they haven't quite solved it yet. So from your perspective, how can agencies begin to protect themselves, how begin to protect their data and keep from getting credential harvest?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one of the things that we saw just about 6 weeks ago or so was the White House released an executive order on cybersecurity focused on zero trust. I think that's a really good first step, and it's top down, right? So it not only will government agencies take notice, but you're going to see the private sector start to look at those things as well. There's been this big shift to the cloud as we talk about, and the big question is how do they protect their data? Agencies need to ensure that any user or device that attaches to the network is authorized, that it's authenticated, and that it's accessing from secure and healthy system. And it's just super important as the perimeter has disappeared. Cloud, telework, and the absence of perimeter are permanent fixtures, and we have to get used to that. A couple things that also they can do is protecting the data in the cloud. So adopting technologies like CASB, Cloud Access Security Broker, for commercial software applications, and ZTNA, which is Zero Trust Network Access for legacy systems, and then effectively looking at a DLP, data loss prevention wrapper around those. Those are really good things that I think you're going to see come out of this executive order, that you're going to see agencies. Some agencies already started to move there, but you're going to continue to see them move there even more quickly, I think.
You bring up a couple of the pieces to that kind of create that zero trust architecture. Are you seeing agencies, when you talk to them, adding the DLP wrapper first, or where do they see the path that maybe, with security, nothing's low hanging fruit, we know that, but what path do you see a lot of agencies taking to say, here's what we need to do either first or a high priority?
Yeah, I wish there was one answer. I think because people are still embracing the cloud and still trying to, there's also this continuous challenge between budget and priority, right? So all of these agencies have a list of IT priorities associated with the budget that they have. So I suspect that things like DLP and CASB and ZTNA and all of these things, and mobile security as well, they're all on everybody's priority list. But is it priority number 6 and 7, and you can only fund the first 5? So I think that's where you begin to see different agencies where in some cases it might appear that they're outpacing others because they've done this first. But it also could be that maybe their priorities are different than another agency that might have done something else ahead of where agency A is.
Well, I think that comes back to both the cyber executive EO that you mentioned, but also the push from OMB around high value assets. Understand what is the most valuable and then start protecting those first, and then kind of work backwards. And that's why I think a lot of agencies, that's why we see some more significant cyber progress over the last year and a half. I mean, just look at the Federal Information Security Management Act report to Congress. I know a lot of people hate FISMA for many reasons, but that shows that agencies are taking a better risk-based approach. Is that the key here for agencies to really look at where their biggest risks are and then start applying some of the zero trust tools to those risky areas?
Yeah, I agree completely. We spent a lot of time working with NIST, right? I'll go back, dating myself a bit, go back 10, 20 years, and many agencies weren't all that excited or interested in what some of the NIST requirements were. But as it pertains to cybersecurity and the shift to cloud, I think there's so many unknowns. The government's trying to look to private industry to kind of, particularly financial sector and some of the other regulated industries that might be out ahead of them a little bit, and looking to try to see, to see some lessons learned there. But they're also looking internally more at places like NIST, some of the other architectures that have been put forth. Again, this whole notion of the executive order with zero trust architecture, I think, is going to be quite pervasive, and some of the doctrine maybe that comes out of the CISA organization within DHS that will begin to really paint a picture for cybersecurity practices, best practices.
Tony, give me a sense of what agencies, as they move forward, as they continue to try to secure their endpoints in the cloud, what's key for them to really understand, what's key for them to keep in mind? Because as you said, no one's, again, we say this all the time, no one's at 0, no one's at 100, everyone's on some sort of somewhere in between. So how do they kind of continue to move faster and of course secure and accessible?
Yeah, I would point back to the big trend that we're seeing again that was accelerated by COVID, which is telework. Um, we've seen, I think, from Lookout's perspective, we were our primary business has been in mobile security, and we've enjoyed a great working relationship with the government for almost the last 10 years. Many agencies have been very bullish on securing mobile devices, others less so. And in full disclosure, we would love to see that increase. I think what we have seen, though, if I just look at some of the metrics inside of our own company, around the April-May timeframe last year, when things began to lock down from COVID, we saw a dramatic increase in interest level in what it is that we do, because everybody was forced to work from home. And again, as I mentioned a little earlier in our talk, that these IT departments were scrambling to try to figure out how to provide safe and secure access to their now and new remote workforce, when that was never, frankly, part of their equation before. It was a matter of shifting budget, it was shifting priorities, and it was quickly working in a partnership with the private sector to try to determine what systems and tools were available to them that they could implement quickly to provide that level of security that they required. So some of that, again, I'll go back to the budget and priority balance. Some of that initial interest did wane. I mean, clearly some of it didn't, and we saw, frankly, quite a large spike in deployment of mobile security type resources across the public sector, not only the U.S. federal government, but state and local governments as well. But some of them, I think, either from a budget or priority perspective, had, because of COVID and telework, probably bit off more than they could chew, and had to address what was required. But I think because of COVID, and the executive order, and also what we're seeing from this administration, which I think is also a direct response from COVID, is their willingness to consider permanent telework. The prior administration was less interested in that. There was some talk about it, but under the Biden administration, we're seeing an opportunity for them to shutter some corporate or government facilities, or diminish them, and there's some cost savings associated with that, because I think they realize that, like we did in the private sector, the productivity rates remain very high with our workforce, and we too, like the government is looking at now, are shifting to some kind of permanent telework options for certain employees.
The hybrid workplace will continue, and that's why things like this, like mobile security and endpoint security, are going to be so much more important going forward. Tony, unfortunately, we're out of time, so let me thank my guest. Tony D'Angelo is the Vice President of the U.S. Public Sector at Lookout. Now let's rejoin the studio for more from the Cloud Exchange on Federal News Network.